Welcome to the Brohoyo podcast, the podcast about Gacha in general and Hoyoverse games in specific. I'm your host, Steven, and this is my co host, David.
Hey everyone.
And this week we're going to be discussing power creep in Gacha games. So, just for clarity, we're going to define power creep here as the increase in power budget of characters, weapons, items, so on and so forth, games in general over time. A character that is released earlier in a game will be weaker than the character that comes out afterwards. So that's the definition we're working on, just to make it clear. So, Dave, real quick, what would be your immediate knee jerk reaction when I say, you know what, this game has a lot of power creep?
Yeah, so the immediate knee-jerk reaction is it gives you pause for concern. Whenever I hear power creep or a game is heavily power creeped, because as a player, especially if you are in the game from the beginning, you have a roster of characters that you've invested in, that you've leveled up, that you've put invested books and skills and talents and equipment stuff into, all for them to ultimately be overshadowed by the new shiny thing that's coming out, the next patch. And so when I hear about trying out a game and the community in the game, I was like, oh, hey, yeah, you got to keep an eye out, watch for the power creep, or we start to see little yellow flags indicating there's going to be power creep. It makes me ultimately less inclined to stick with the game long term, invest in the game if I want to throw a few dollars towards the developers and buy a pack. But what about you, Steve? What's your knee jerk reaction when you hear power creep is in a game?
Very similar to yours. Power creep is very much so something that we associate with as a negative, that we don't want to see power creep in our games. We, at least I personally, would. I'm not a giant fan of it, especially when in gotcha games there's potentially real money being thrown down. Having a character that you could have potentially dropped a lot of money. I'm not going to put a number out there, but you could have potentially dropped a lot of money on a character that in a year is redundant or even weak in comparison to other offerings available. Definitely is a that's no good type scenario. I've got to put a little Sonic in here. But yeah, I definitely am not a fan of it. Going off of that, and I knowing that we don't like it, Dave, can you come up with a scenario, or can we come up with an argument for power creep or why power creep exists in games, especially gotcha games?
As far as for gotcha games from a developer standpoint, in terms of why it exists, that's I feel would be relatively straightforward. Money, because by creating a new shiny toy that is better than all the other toys, insert Toy Story meme, I don't want to play with you anymore, dropping Woody to play with Buzz Lightyear, right?
Hmm.
It's going to incentivize the player base, especially in a lot of the gotcha games, with the kind of the FOMO feel, like they're all going to miss out if I don't get this character. They're going to want to pull for that character, whether that be on currency that they've saved up or potentially spend money to pull the shiny new toy that is stronger than characters that are on their roster or their account, or it does a particular job better than maybe somebody that is already on your roster. So that I think is the most obvious. I think why power creep exists in games from a developer standpoint. I think from maybe a player standpoint, I don't. I'm going to be hard pressed to think about if there's a positive angle for power creep from a player. I guess this is a reach even with
Hmm.
this would be if there is power creep, it means that your game is lasting long enough and has a community big enough to sustain it over an extended period of time. And again, and I understand this is a reach because sometimes power creep can happen very quickly.
Yeah.
But for those games that are around longer and do power creep, I think it's inevitable for, let's say, a game like FGO, Fate Grand Order, that's been around for,
Not Family Guy
man,
Online.
yeah, not Family High Online, Fate Grand Order, or a game like Brave Nine, formerly known as Brown Dust, but now it's Brave Nine. They're celebrating their seventh anniversary. There is inevitably going to be power creep in a game that comes up that has been around that long, and I think also, and we'll get into this, I think, a little bit later as far as alternatives to outright power creep, but like new game mechanics and
Mhm.
things like that. We can touch on that maybe in a little bit. But that would be my reach as far as from a player perspective why power creep is good. It just means that your game has had some longevity and has a community that's supporting it to last that long where power creep is inevitable. But any unique thoughts from you, or you can maybe share some of those thoughts, or what do you think?
I think the key when I look at power creep is it's more about the rate than it is necessarily that it happens. I agree with you that from a business point of view, it's the simplest knob to turn in order to generate income and interest in new characters is just make a character that's stronger than the last character. Then people will feel obligated, especially in like a PvP gacha, to buy in order to keep up. You got to keep that gear treadmill going and so forth. However, I do think that from a player side, there is an argument that, like inflation, a low, slow amount of power creep is actually good for the health of a game. Primarily so that newer players entering the game can catch up a little bit easier in comparison to if you're a day one player and there's a flat power curve, then every new character you get over the course of the history of that game is just adding a new tool to your belt that a new player isn't going to ever be able to catch up with. There's never going to be a watershed moment where they're able to go, okay, I can get this character who is just stronger and will allow me to catch up to that person who's played for a year. Now, obviously, the money side of it is a rougher issue there, but just purely from a player standpoint, I think a low, slow amount of power creep is okay and could actually be healthy for a game and be valuable on the player side, mainly for newer players. I get why for older players it's frustrating to see characters drop off, especially again if you've paid money for them or if you've saved up for them and a year later unfortunately that character is no longer as viable as it used to be. I get that feeling, but overall, over a 5 year time span, I think a 10, 15, 20% power boost in like character power budget is overall healthy for the game. I don't like it, just like I don't like inflation, but I think it's one of those realities that overall more good than harm comes out of it as long as it's kept in check. I think the big issue with power creep is when you see those massive spikes or developers abusing power creep, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, and some of the issues to that point, right? The developers release a character that is very obviously going to shift the meta. It's meta defining. You got to have it, and I've seen this happen in a couple of gotchas that I've been playing. Some that I've dropped recently, but some that I'm still continuing to play. And what they do is that I'll take Brown Dust 2 as an example of one that I'm still playing. And so they released, I think, a 2 month or two ago, Grand Hilder, who has a taunt. So in PvP, you can set this skill to auto proc. So you ideally you put it on your defense team. So when players attack you, she taunts and everybody will attack her, and then she gets this massive energy shield that you have to chew through before you can even get to her main health and then the rest of the team ultimately.
Mhm.
And this was a big issue. And then they introduced like another character that had a mechanic that basically was the answer to that. So the whole meta in PvP shifted to you got to have Grand Hilder. You're
Mhm.
not going to really rise the ranks. But then the very next banner or two after that, it was okay. Well, here's an answer. Here's a character that directly counters, or maybe it was vice versa. They introduced a character, and then Grand Hilder was the counter to that because it forced them to attack it. Either way,
Yeah.
they basically create a problem and then they provide the solution. There's also that aspect of power creep, is what I'm long-windedly trying to get at.
Yeah. And I in some ways I would almost say that's a simultaneously a problem with it because obviously you have a character who just dominates in whatever their niche is. In this case defense. But it also can lead into the alternatives that we potentially will talk about in a little bit where they just start throwing jigsaw pieces at you and going, we're going to create this issue and we're going to constantly be moving where the meta is in order to force you to constantly catch up and play along. And again, at the end of the day, I don't think anyone likes power creep. This is not something where I think anybody's going to be coming out and going, power creep is great. It's the bestest ever. It's a devil that we have to deal with more so than something I think anybody loves.
Here's an interesting take, and this may be a hot take, but we don't like power creep. As players, we don't like power creep. But ultimately, yes, developers make the decision to put out characters that are stronger, but ultimately, you could maybe even make the argument, and this is the hot take, that players are asking for stronger characters. And
Okay.
some may explicitly be asking for stronger characters, but others in the sense that whenever a character comes out in your gacha that's maybe what people would call mid or middle of the road, middle ground, if that character really appeals to you because you really like their aesthetic or you like their game style or something like that, you don't want to ultimately be told that the character that you like or that you love is not meta or is not a stronger unit.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you raise hell on social media or wherever it is, asking that they buff the character. And then that leads to essentially a response, and maybe you get enough people behind your cause and the developers do something and they buff the character. So in that way, players say they don't want power creep, but they kind of do because they don't want the characters that they like to be middle of the road,
Mm-hmm.
or
Yeah.
don't spend on characters or banners come out for
Mm-hmm.
characters that aren't mid. And this is also, you can look at data and look at banners in the past. And if a character wasn't meta or wasn't talked about being meta, the sales on the banner maybe aren't as good. So as much as the developers have a big hand in power creep
Mm-hmm.
and the rate of the power creep, my hot take is players have a hand in it too. Maybe not as much, but maybe just as much. That would, I think, be the
Yeah.
hottest take, is that they have just as much as the developers do as to this power creeping and how often it happens.
I'm impressed that someone could say something so brave and so right to a certain decision to a certain point. I agree with you. I think that yeah, there like I'm thinking back to last episode when we were doing our top 10 bottom 5 or top 5 bottom 5, and I mentioned Kazuha and him being decried as a Sucrose side grade. And Sucrose is not a bad character. She's one of the original 4, I think is what they're called now. She's one of the 4-star characters from the beginning of the game that's really strong to the point where she can hold her own in 5-star teams. And even if he's a side grade, he's not bad. That being on par with Sucrose is nothing to be ashamed of. Now, admittedly, again, she's a 4-star, but it's not anything to be ashamed of. She punches well above her weight, but you get a lot of that. Another one was Yelan, that again we mentioned last episode, where a lot of people were comparing her to the book boy. I'm not even going to bother attempting his name. The book boy, where they have very similar kits. There's mainly a trait of damage versus survivability, but even when she was being released, there were people going, she's garbage. She's mid at best because we've already got this character for free that will do what she does. And but don't you want a second version of him? He's hands down the second or third best 4-star in the game. He's on every team that needs a Hydro reaction. Now you get 2 of them, or you can double them up on a team. And that's how you get a lot of Hydro teams. Yeah, I agree with you. I think that in a lot of ways, the way we discuss characters, especially in a sort of zero sum aspect of you can only ever have one of something, that if you're going to be pulling for this, you look at it almost as if it's a vacuum, that you can't have 2 copies of something. You can only ever have the one. I don't know if I made sense there, but yeah, we treat it as a zero sum game instead of maybe stepping back and looking at it from a broader perspective and going, okay, this character is very good in their niche. This is what their niche is. If this is something you're interested in, maybe you should pull for it. We instead tend to look at raw numbers.
And I'm glad that my word vomit and word salad was able to get the point across in some fashion. So I appreciate that. I got that. And I think you touched on a little bit there as well. It's, yeah, sometimes we get these meta defining units, and then we get other units that maybe aren't meta in a particular game mode, but they may have a niche where they are the shining star of what you build a team around. And so it just depends on what the game mode is. And for a game like Genshin, where combat wise there aren't too many game modes per se. I
Yeah.
wouldn't say they have the stereotypical all of the stereotypical modes that you would find in a Gacha game. They have some of them, but they don't have all of them, right?
It's
And
a
what I
bit
mean
more
by that
arena.
is obviously you have your story modes, you have your tower modes, and they have their spin on those things. But even looking comparatively to Honkai Star Rail, you have simulated universe, so that roguelike thing, and you have MOC now, and you have all these. You have a couple different game modes that are about different things, and this was something I think we touched on a little bit about characters and their usefulness in one game mode versus the other. Where is it a single target game mode, or is it one where it's going to be a bunch of enemies in one singular wave? And Genshin doesn't really have that per se. So there's not a lot of niches in that regards. Whereas with Star Rail, we may have a few more niches that, oh, you're really good at killing one big HP sponge of a boss,
Mhm.
but you're not as good, or there are better units that are good at clearing waves of multiple little monsters.
Yeah, or again, you need something with more survivability because you're in a more of a marathon type
Yeah,
mode.
yeah, like a raid boss type game mode that you see in games like Nikke or in games like Eversoul or Blue Archive. Epic 7 has a mode as well with the guild boss, same type of thing,
Mhm.
which allows different characters to shine than if you were just playing a regular campaign story mode where you want a 3-star each stage by finishing it within 60 seconds and not letting any units die, the
Yeah.
stereotypical what it takes to 3-star something.
Yeah, finish in X time, make sure nobody dies, and typically some third, whatever.
Sometimes it's nice and it's just, hey, just clear it gets you 1-star, but
Yeah,
sometimes they're mean and they're like, you got to do it, but you have to use 2 water units on your team, and it's
yeah,
like, no,
yeah.
my team's not based around water units. You're forcing me to shuffle around.
Yeah, or you have to have the X character on your team. Or
Anyway,
anyways,
that's a whole nother topic that I feel a certain way about anyway.
uh-huh.
But as far as power creeps, right? So in its truest and most simplest form, see, like we've been talking about, yeah, it's new characters, the new toys outshine characters or weapons or things that have existed that have come out previously to it. But there are alternatives to power creeps that sometimes raise eyebrows when they're implemented in these gotcha games. And so I want to talk about some of those that maybe you've interacted with or you've seen in your games.
Okay, it's going to be a little bit weird here, but one of the ways that I've seen, and unfortunately I don't have a great example that I'm willing to talk about right now of it, is the puzzle box type of power creep, where what happens is the developer moves, instead of increasing the power of their characters, they change the requirements of whatever content there is. Using Genshin as an example here, some of you might remember back in Inazuma, there was a big issue where shields were just the most powerful thing defensively that you could get. They gave you complete immunity to stagger. They negated the need to heal as a replacement of it because it would just absorb damage for you. They're hands down just better, and Zhongli didn't help because he was just he got a little bit overtuned, let's just say. And
Do not slander the Geo Daddy. Anyway, go ahead.
just a little. But anyways, it was becoming an issue where anytime a healer would come out, people would basically go, "Why would I bother? I can either perfect dodge, or I can use the ult cutscene in order to become immune to damage and avoid attacks, or I can shield." There's too many alternate ways to mitigate damage to the point where healing was just considered a completely useless stat, especially for high end players. Low end
Um,
players, trust me, not so much because I, as a low end player, it was an issue.
I see. This is
Um,
you standing for Kokomi, but go ahead, please.
a little, but what they did is they released the wolves, and I believe they are just called the wolves in the character. But what they were they were an enemy type that when they hit you, not when they dealt damage, just when they hit you, they would apply a damage over time effect that affected the entire party and would reduce the entire party's hit points to I believe it was 10% if they were off field, and if you were on field, it could actually kill you. So the only way that you could safely fight them was you had to have a healer to heal you through that damage. And ideally, you would have one that could do a group, a party heal, and get both characters that are on field and off field. And that sort of, I'm calling it puzzle box design. It's probably not. I'm not a game designer. I don't know what the proper term is. That sort of design where they basically go, okay, here's this new mechanic that the only way you're going to get through is if you get this new set of characters, or you use this old set of characters, but they're not really designed around it. You're going to need somebody who's a little bit more tailored if you really want to be comfortable with playing it. Is one method I've seen. Before I go off on a long spree here, David, have you seen any other alternatives in the wild?
Yes, a couple different things that I've seen in terms of maybe power creep or answers to power creep would be implementations of maybe new types of systems, or there's the standard. Sometimes developers will go back and rework a character, or they will fine tune them, change up the kit a little bit or the skills on the character. That's one I've seen before, but in terms of retuning the characters or new implementations, what I mean by that is I'll use a couple of examples and what I mean by that. So I'll start just so in Azure Lane, you have some of your ship foos, right?
Hmm.
Who are maybe the SR rarity. They're not SSRs, and they were pretty decent because there are some that are actually pretty good, even though they're just SRs. But they tend to fall off as we get into the UR stage of things, and maybe in future end game content.
Hmm.
But they introduced this or this system in the game called retrofit, where you would invest additional materials that you would farm and additional experience, money, books, things like that, and ascension stuffs to ultimately retrofit the character. And once you completed the retrofit table, it boosted their rarity the next thing. They got a new splash art skin type thing, which, if you know anything about Azure Lane, you know that's a big selling point. They're usually really nice,
Hmm.
or they have fun live 2D stuff. Anyway, but so that retrofit system, or Epic 7 has a system similar to this as well. I believe it's called Awakening. That may not be the right name. I may be confusing the systems. But essentially, with the awakening of a unit, you had, for these older units that maybe weren't as good, you had 4 tasks to do with them: kill 500 of a certain type of enemy, play 300 matches in arenas, or whatever it was. And once you do these 4 tasks, you awaken them. It tweaks one of their abilities, gives them some additional stats, and then you can then invest even more growth materials to add passively to abilities or stats, things like that. The big one for me that I remember that I think it killed the game. I believe the game is actually technically still going, but it's for those that remember or played or still play King's Raid. They introduced, so you had your characters themselves, which they actually had a really nice way of getting the characters because there wasn't a gacha for the characters per se. You could outright buy them with rubies that you got in game. But where some of the gacha stuff was, or the revamping the characters, was they had unique weapons. So each character had a unique weapon that tweaked their skill or gave them an additional skill. This was years ago, so I'm a little fuzzy on the details. And we're like, okay, that was fine. And then you star leveled up the weapons by getting duplicates. And we're like, okay. And then some characters were starting to fall off that maybe had been a prime good for farming the red dragon or the black dragon for
Hmm.
gear or whatever it was. And then they introduced unique treasures. And this is, I think, ultimately what killed the game because it made it very pay to win.
Hmm.
Because now not only did you have to get their unique weapons, get those leveled up, get duplicates of those, but then you had to go and get their unique treasures as well. Nikkei, I believe, is going to be implementing a system similar to unique treasures to some of their older Nikkeis that aren't meta and not getting a lot of love. So I'm a little nervous as to how they're going to implement it. I They do a lot of things very well, so I feel like they'll do a good job with it, and they've earned a lot of good faith with me. But I'm still slightly nervous about how they're going to implement it because of the implications in other games and how they've implemented this work or quote unquote workaround to power creeping to try and update older characters.
Okay. Fair
Uh,
enough.
so enough of me being long-winded. You said you were before you get long-winded. So Where are you taking us next here? Where are we going?
So, my next thought is, and this isn't really a gotcha game. This is, I guess technically it was an MMO, but Guild Wars, just the original Guild Wars back, oh, you know what, I don't even want to say how many years ago. I think they had a very good system for handling power creep because your character was limited to level 20 in Guild Wars. But what you did and what kind of motivated you to move forward and get your character, to build your character over time, was instead of leveling up your character and getting a bigger number, what they would do is they would release new skills for your character. And basically, the way the game played is whenever you were in a central hub, you could pull, I believe it was 8 abilities onto your taskbar, and that was the abilities that you could use when you're out in the field. But they were like cards from Magic the Gathering, or other TCGs, where they comboed together. You could use them. You created your deck, and then you would go out and use it. And the motivation for a lot of people when playing the game was going out and collecting all of the different skills that the character had. Now, transferring that to a gotcha game, I don't know. There'd be a lot of kind of nitty gritty to get into in order to try and make that work in a gotcha environment. But I think the idea itself is sound, that instead of forcing people to level a character, actually, Limbus Company, I guess, would be a rough example. It's not perfect because I do believe that the different skins that you basically get for the characters are of arguable power level. But a system where basically your characters are a little bit more set, but you move them sideways. You're getting different tools to put in your tool belt instead of getting a just a more powerful version of Fireball, or you're getting a Raiden Shogun is just replaced by Raiden 2 Electric Boogaloo, or a little bit more close to my heart, Arlecchino is just a replacement for Hu Tao. Like, Arlecchino isn't a perfect one, but there's a certain amount of just Arlecchino is Hu Tao 2 Electric Boogaloo, with just slightly better numbers and a little bit of ease of play issue. But
Ill issue? No, go ahead.
a little bit, I'm not gonna lie. I don't like having to jump through the middle of my charge attacks, but something like that, where you do set a hard cap on what the power budget is of all of your characters, but you focus on primarily building out a tool belt for your players, and that's how you encourage them to. And thinking back on it, this is coming across very similar to the force a problem and then solution that I mentioned earlier. The idea here would be that it's less of a, okay, we're going to force you down these specific metas in that sense, and more of a, okay, it's open ended. You can solve these problems however you want, but we're giving you different tools to let you do that. Is one alternative. Again, I've never really seen that implemented in a gacha. I think it's just one where the design space is probably too small in a lot of these to get away with it, but that would be one alternative that I could see, and it would come with its own problems. But regardless, I'll kick the ball back over to you, David. Do you have any other ideas or thoughts or examples of alternatives?
No, yeah, aside from what we've talked about, some of these systems that they do, whether it be implementing, yeah, a reworking of a character's kit, adding an awakening type system or a retrofit type system, those can help counterbalance the power creep or completely shift it on the other end. So it's now character A was power creep by character B, but character A's retrofit is going to be better than character B, and then eventually they're going to give character B a retrofit, and then that's going to power creep character A's retrofit, and then and so on and so forth, and the cycle continues to a point that if you're getting to that type of problem, your gotcha game, hopefully that means it's been around for a long time, because to what you mentioned earlier, the rate at which they're power creeping is not excessive.
Yeah.
It's a steady curve and not just like a roller coaster, quick like up, shoot up the power creeping scale. And we've talked a lot about power creep and examples of it in other games, and you hinted at it maybe a little bit with the Hu Tao Arlecchino comparison. But let's talk about the state of power creep within Genshin. Are we seeing it across the board? Have we maybe seen it in a few characters? And what do you see moving forward?
So, I guess I'm going to look at it from a historical point of view. So, I do apologize. I'm going to steal the mic and I'm going to be on my soapbox for a moment here. I think for the first year, 2 years of the game, power creep was relatively level. You had a few outliers. I would say Ganyu and Hu Tao are ones. Zhongli on his second run after they made those changes was a little bit of an outlier. But for the most part, they kept it very reasonable in their power creep. And then we hit Sumeru, and I don't think Sumeru was power creep in the ceiling side of things. I don't think that the cap got unreasonably higher than anywhere else, any of the other regions. I think the problem is that the floor came up, that it became very easy to hit big damage numbers using Dendro reactions, especially because a lot of Dendro reactions aren't the same level of technical. You have to make sure you're hitting one into the other in order to get this and to get that. They're less sort of skill combo focused. It's more, look, just throw a bunch of elements out there and the enemies die. And that's what I mean by the floor coming up, where the skill level required to get big numbers, dropped. That it was very easy to do. It was much more consistent. And then we went to Fontaine, and one of the things that I especially hear a lot in the theory crafting community and from other people is that in Fontaine, it seems like the numbers are being juiced. That we had a number of characters back to back to back where they just hit like trucks. We have Water Dragon guy. I completely
Nubelet.
Nouvelet, thank you. I knew it was French, and I was nervous about trying to pronunciate it. So Nouvelet, who's again, he's got just insane numbers for his kit. We have Fulcor. We have the Archon of the
Farina.
region. Thank you, Farina. We have Farina, who just gives insane damage buffs. Her numbers that she gives out are gross. The only kind of saving grace is that she's a little bit restrictive in her building, what's required for her teams. But otherwise, she hypercharges already boosted numbers from Nouvelet. We then got Navia, whose numbers are also off the scale, mainly because she's a Geo character and she can't rely on reactions, so she just needs a bigger stick to hit stuff with. And then we've got Arlecchino, who just came out, and I'm gonna be honest, my Arlecchino is not well built. She's level 80. She doesn't have her signature weapon. She's got a jade spear on her, and her artifacts are not amazing. They're basically what I had in my bag, and I was willing to get to 20. I was willing to upgrade to 20. Her talents are only sitting at talent level 6 or 7 for the most part, because I've been lazy and haven't unlocked her actual boss fight in order to unlock her higher level talents. And she still hits like a truck. She's not hitting Hu Tao, my built Hu Tao numbers, but she's also half a character in comparison to my Hu Tao. And she's easily doing decent, if not more than decent numbers. Yeah, I feel like Fontaine is where we're seeing kind of the gas getting poured in on getting these characters power crept, especially with enemies as well. Enemies are getting tougher, and the fights are getting harder for. If you were running an all Mondstadt team, that's going to be rough, I think, going forward. But what are your thoughts? Maybe I have let the cat out of the bag, but what are your thoughts, David?
So I think you do make some fair points about what we've seen. And yeah, with the introduction to Dendro back in Sumeru and how we shifted down to Fontaine and how Dendro interacts and made some elemental interaction, made some elements essentially relevant again. I think I can agree with that. As far as like a one-to-one character power creeping other characters, I think we've seen some. I think we've seen some. I don't think it's been as egregious as some other gotchas that are out there. I think we've seen it on a smaller scale. I remember it was a funny joke I saw back. Oh, I think it was the introduction of Sumeru. I think it was. It was like, yep, we're being power creeped, and it was a spoiler video image, and you click view spoiler, and it's the recipe for the revive, which just
Mm-hmm.
requires one bird egg for the Mondstadt revive, and then the recipe for the revive from Fontaine was like two things. You had to farm two separate items. Yep, we're being power creeped. Cooking materials or while that was a funny meme, I think character wise, 1 to 1, there's maybe been a little bit of it as far as exploration. We've definitely gotten some power creep. There are definitely teams it's easier to explore the overworld. You have somebody like Kazuha, somebody like Zhao who's able to jump up high, or somebody Jin Yun or the retainer, wind
Yeah,
retainer, cloud retainer. Thank you. I
no
don't
problem.
wind cloud. I was anyway. But yeah, I got her name. I just couldn't get what her title was. And yeah, wild. Anyway, somebody like them, there's definitely power creep in terms of overworld exploration. Whereas instead of having to figure out how am I going to climb this giant wall without running out of stamina type thing. But in terms of a combat, you talked about it a little bit where, yeah, we had characters and the roster wasn't as huge at the start. So somebody like Sucrose, when she came out, was pretty good. And if you couldn't get Venti, you were probably running a Sucrose in your team if you were running that type of reaction team. But now, yeah, as we've gone on, yeah, we've seen characters implemented like Kazuha that's better at sucking them up than Sucrose is, and does that. And even to a point, Kazuha kind of power crept Venti a little bit in terms of functionality, what you do in combat. And then, yeah, you talked a little bit about Arlecchino versus Hu Tao, both being similar in that they serve as a pyro damage dealer, and Arlecchino's numbers are comparable, even though she's not fully built out yet. I think you still have your mainstays. I think I don't know if anybody does what Ganyu does better than her in terms of that cryo damage and a charged shot bow user. I think right now, I was, I wonder if there's a consensus on the community and who they feel the strongest characters are. Because I did see a thread the other day that got me thinking about this, and I didn't go into the thread. I try not to read too much into just general threads when it comes to tier lists.
Mm-hmm.
I try and look at calculations and numbers, and this thread wasn't really providing that. But what the point of it was that they were talking about who they felt the three strongest main DPS characters were in Genshin at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Neuvillette was on there. I believe Al Haytham was on there, and I can't remember the third. And the point of all this to say is I wonder if that general consensus is shared amongst everybody in the community. And if it is, even just looking at those two characters that I remember out of the three, those are all newer characters from Fontaine, or in Al Haytham's case, Sumeru. Granted, it was towards, I believe, the end of Sumeru is when Al Haytham, he wasn't right at the outset. He was kind of middle end, if memory serves, in the order of things. The quote unquote strongest characters, if we're taking this thread as gospel, no mention of Mondstadt or even Liyue characters.
Yeah, and again, that's not necessarily like a bad thing. I think the problem with it reaching way back to the beginning with new players being able to get that leg up is that because of the way Genshin handles mats and materials and everything else, new characters are actually locked behind physically having to haul your butt all the way across the map in order to get to where you need to get to in order to get the materials at a low. That I think is a larger issue than power creep in a lot of ways in Genshin.
Yeah, and
Um,
ultimately, again, this is just the role of the main damage dealer. I think a lot of the supports and the buffer type characters have been pretty consistent throughout Genshin. Bennett is still a very strong option to be used as a buffer there. And like for me and my Navia team, right, to your point, using Navia as the main damage dealer because her multiplier, she's got a big stick being Geo. But Bennett being one of the original 4-star supports, and then Jingling, of course, our cooking friend from Liyue, who's again Liyue being the second region of the game. She's been around for a while and being a good sub DPS slash supporter
mm,
has been pretty consistent. Or you look at other characters, Zhongli still, despite being from the Liyue era, still being one of the strongest shielders. You have Kokomi, who that's in Azuma. So I think as far as supporting characters, I think they do a good job of maintaining a balance, giving you flexibility of a number of different characters that so you can maybe play two characters that you like more. Because then, yeah, you get up into the supports that have come out. Somebody like Farina, that's come out and being a stronger support. And then we'll see, what comes here in the future and characters that are going to come out. But as far as the main damage dealers themselves, I'd be interested to see, generally speaking, in the community, are the top tier DPS people all from Sumeru, all from Fontaine, or does anybody from Mondstadt even breach the top 5, top 10 even?
I mean, I could see them maybe in the top 10. I can't believe that a top DPS would be from Mondstadt at this point. Unless it's a character that, like, to be blunt, they release, the Captain of the Knights. Because we're about to go into the war area, and apparently he's either there or he's in Snezhnaya. So maybe we'll get him at some point, and just because of the way timing works, he'll technically be a Mondstadt character that's coming out later. But really quickly, I do want to touch on your comment about supports. And I think part of the reason why supports are much more evergreen than DPS is that if you're a main DPS, your personal numbers matter a lot more than when you're a support, where a lot of times it's more about who you're buffing rather than your own personal stats. Bennett's a little bit of a oddball there, so's Guoba. Guoba mainly gets to exist the way she does is because of her snapshotting. If she didn't snapshot, she'd be horribly power crept at this point, I think. But I do think supports have a much more evergreen aspect to them because they're more about making somebody else better and stacking on top of their number. Whereas a DPS, and this is just based off of Genshin's system, you could develop a system where supports massively have power creep as well, and they're disgusting. I do think Farina is an example of a power creep in the support half of the game, or the numbers that she buffs people by are just so extreme that it's a little bit nuts. But sorry, I just wanted to point that out before we move forward.
No, that's good. And while you were doing that, I pulled up a list of Genshers. And so to just live test my own theory, going through the Mondstadt 5 stars. I'll just run through alphabetical order as I come across them here. 5 stars, Diluc. While he was a cool 5 star when he came out and had some fun gameplay, shoot your Firebird across with his ult, not a top 5 DPS.
He's got a little bit of extra life with Cloud Retainer just because of his fall damage or his
plunge. Okay,
his plunge. But
sure, but I'm looking for the top
like I
of
said,
the
not
top,
top five, not top five.
Overall, right? I'm not looking for niche. Oh, he's really good at this one thing, but then other things he's not. I think. But anyway, but D Luke was right. He was one of the original Mondstadt characters. Eula, while technically a Mondstadt character, came out during Liwa. But even if we go down that road, as much as I love her, and again, because going back to last week's episode, she's in my top 5 favorite characters. She's not a top DPS. Ganyu is technically Liwa. She was the only one I could think off the top of my head that would maybe crack. But again, I'm looking at Mondstadt characters, and Ganyu is Jean. Never been a top 5 DPS, not really DPS, more of a support healer type, right? And again, I'm just specifically looking at 5 stars. I'm not looking at 4 stars like Lisa, Amber, Kaya, people like that. Not
4 star DPSs don't get to break into the list.
Not if the 5 stars are struggling from Mondstadt, 4 stars, not so much. But Kaching maybe saw a little bit of a re-emergence with the introduction of Dendro, but I wouldn't put her in the top 5 of DPS characters. Klee, your favorite character?
No, she doesn't.
No, she's not even close. Scrolling on through here, I think there's maybe 1 or 2 left. Again, technically more associated with Liwa, but she was an original character. She's on the standard banner, right? She's not even a DPS. She's a healer, reviver type, right? Moving
arguably
on.
Worst character in the game. Yeah.
Leah, again, technically Liwa or Child, right? Technically Liwa, but not really up there. Venti was great. Had some solid utility when he came out, but he was supplanted by Kazuha, which was just Inazuma.
Not even
and then
Inazuma.
Zhao.
He was end of Liwa.
Oh, end of Liwa going into Inazuma, right? So he was blazing the trail into that. Zhao would be the other 5 star, again, more maybe associated with Liwa than Mondstadt per se, but not in the top deep main DPS character types. And those are your Mondstadt characters. And
Yeah.
I even, like I said, threw in a few Leo crossovers. And the only one that I could even make a case for probably would be Ganyu.
Yeah, and even then, that's Ganyu's been running into trouble in the past few years just because Freeze has dropped off. But
Frieza's dropped off. Her play style isn't for everybody. Not everybody loves the pullback charge shot. And I'll be honest, if I was playing on mobile, I would have zero interest in her. I'm not trying to do that on a phone.
fair,
I only do it because I would play with a mouse and keyboard.
fair enough.
But yeah, that's my opinions there on the power creep. Now I do want to touch on a little bit with Star Rail power creep. I know we're very early in the lifespan comparatively to Genshin within Star Rail, but even within Star Rail, I would almost make the case we've seen more power creep in Star Year than we have with Genshin's 3 years. Maybe a hot take.
I'd push back on that one.
Okay. So it's a
Um,
hot take.
yeah,
Okay.
I'll push back on that one. I'll call that a spicy take.
Okay.
Um, the main the thing is, I can see where you're coming from. I think the big issue is that even though it's been over a year, there are still a lot of roles in Star Rail that aren't being directly competed in at this point in time. There's still a lot of slots to fill, as it were. So we haven't had a lot of characters that are directly one on one, same style, going up against each other. There is an argument that, and Lucha, not Lucha,
Oh
Laucha,
ho ho and yeah, Luch talking about for healing.
yeah, that those two are probably the most head to head. The other example would probably be Blade and Jingliu.
And even Imbiber Dong.
Yeah, I'm keeping him off just because mechanically he's slightly different, but I would probably throw him in there as well. That those three kind of pushed against each other and were jockeying for that same destruction DPS spot. I think they do it all differently enough and are comparable ish that it's not too bad power creep wise. It's more like different flavors of what you want, but I can definitely see the argument that it feels like we're getting a lot more power creep in Honkai Star Rail. But I think part of that is just, again, we're getting a lot of characters that are filling out niches, and they're not necessarily. Again, going back to earlier in the conversation, there's a lot of people who are treating it as if you can only have one copy, like you only can ever have one healer, where it's a game where explicitly you run two teams in a number of different types of content. You're going to need two copies of stuff. You don't
Hmm.
necessarily need the same thing, but having two healers is not the end of the world. Having two 5-star healers is not going to doom your account. There's
And also to what we touched on earlier too, the reason why maybe it's harder to compare people role for role as opposed to in Genshin is because Star Rail does have a few more game modes. So we said, you could have somebody who's niche and very good at this one game mode for again the bullet sponge, the HP tank boss, but they're not the best option when it comes to dealing with wave after wave of dispatching enemies very quickly type things. So there is that factor in there as well to your point. But yeah, just seeing the supports almost because like when Rune May right came out,
Mhm.
she was oh my gosh, game breaking must pull, and then we get Sparkle 2 cycles later, and it's, oh no, she's really good type.
I would actually argue that Robin coming out, and I feel comfortable talking about Robin because they've already, a number of content creators have released reviews of her on the creator. We know about her kit. Her kit is in the wild at this point.
We'll do. I know we're going to break down a few of the characters and our initial thoughts from the drip marketing that was released for a few characters for
True.
Star Rail.
I
So
just want to put a quick pin in this where I feel like a lot of people are talking about Robin as a power creep on Ruan Mei as like a direct one to one, and I don't think that that's necessarily 100% accurate. Let me just throwing that in there for the power creep side of it. We'll
okay,
get more into it.
yeah, we'll dive into our
Yeah,
initial thoughts and reactions to that drip marketing that came out, I think a week or so ago, if that. But yeah, but as far as Star Rail goes, that's my take on that. In my opinion, like I said, I think the game having not been out as long and yet seeing, you know, we had even from the early outsets, we had somebody like One when he came out, the Lightning Lord,
Mhm.
and then shortly thereafter we get into Imbiber, Lune Don Hung, we get into Blade, and even to an extent Jing Liu, right? All those seem to be one-upping each other. And then yeah, healer wise, we went from Bailu to Luocha to Ho-Oh, which I think Luocha was maybe the pinnacle healer. I think he's maybe agreed upon as the best healer in the game. I think that's generally pretty accepted as a statement.
Yes, with the caveat being that he is the best healer in the game. And the reason why I'm emphasizing that is because Huo is considered the kind of the best support slash. She's the one that you want
A
for your.
hybrid.
Yeah, you want her for your sustain spot because she does more than heal. Whereas
Yeah,
Lucha
with the attack
will
boost and then
heal.
giving you energy. And yeah, she does a few other things. That's fair.
Yeah.
But anyway, but that's just something for me to keep an eye on moving forward because even within the sustain category, if I go to sustain, when the game came out, we had Japard,
Mhm.
and everybody was like, "Oh my God, Japard! That's who you go for." And now it's not. It's Fu Xuan is your team shielder, and now I think even maybe Aventurine seems pretty solid in terms of sustaining and shields, and then fits into the follow-up team builds as well.
Yeah, I would say Adventurine is probably a more direct upgrade over Japard than say Fushuan, just because of the way shielding works. But that's again, we don't need to get into those weeds.
Like I said, it's nothing. And again, to contextualize my take with Star Rail, none of this has been egregious,
Hmm.
right? It's not been egregious. This person is shifting so much the meta that if you don't pull for her, you will fall behind, or you don't pull for this character, you'll not be able to do all the content type stuff. So it's nothing in that regards, and I don't think they would ever move into a direction like that because we have the track record with Genshin. But it is just something to discuss and keep an eye on. But we talked about a little bit. I want to move into talking about there were four characters that were announced and we got some drip marketing for. So let's jump into that now. So with the announcement for patch 2.2 and then looking down the road even to 2.3, we had some drip marketing come out for Star Rail leading up to that live stream. And within that drip marketing, we have been introduced to and learned more about characters. So, characters Robin and Boothill will be releasing in Phase 1, Phase 2 of version 2.2. And then in some combination down the future, Jade and Firefly are going to be released. And so we got some images and drip marketing for those two, but beyond that, we don't know too much else. But I want to start, Steve, with
Hmm.
what your initial thoughts were when these characters were announced, these four. What'd you like? What jumped out to you? And what are you thinking?
What I'm thinking is that way back in the beginning of Coney, Pia Coney, whatever, the beginning of 2.0, I was talking about what characters I was looking forward to, and Robin and Firefly were top of list. And I was saying at the time, based off of what we've seen so far, I think after Black Swan, I'm really only interested in those two. And I said that thinking that, oh, I'm not going to see these two until 2.5, 2.6. They're a ways off. I'm good. I'm safe. I'm in danger. Things are not looking good from my Star Jade stash at the moment, especially with Jade coming out because she's another character that just looks chef's kiss. Boot Hill is also a very cool cowboy type character. Unfortunately, he is filling a role that I already have fairly significantly covered, which is a hunt character, and I just don't really need single target damage at this point in time. What were your thoughts?
Yeah. When we were introduced to some of these characters within the story, you get the inkling that, oh, they're going to be pullable down the road. We're not going to get the Senora treatment on some of these, surely. And so I was intrigued by them. And so when we learned that, hey, we're getting Robin, and then we're going to get Boot Hill, similar to you with Boot Hill, he looks cool. And I do have, there are some like small things I like about what we've seen about him. Like when I say small tasks, like small touches aesthetically, or that they've done with how he looks and some of his skills and actions. Like you said, he fills a role that I already have, being a hyper carry main DPS character, and I like the character that I have in that role better than him. I got Jing Liu, she fills that role for me,
Mm-hmm.
and I like her a lot better. And she's also E1 because I'm really lucky, at least on her first one. I lost a 50-50 on this rerun, but in losing the 50-50 on her, it has set me up for a character that I will be pulling for, and I'm excited to pull for. I would probably estimate we get them in 2.3, but that would be Jade. So I know we were introduced to Firefly and Jade in the drip marketing, and when I saw both of those, I mean, we were introduced to Firefly in the story, and she was having a more active role. Jade has also been introduced in the story, just in a more like very like subtle way. Like she wasn't like a big intricate part like Firefly was. She was in like one minor cutscene that involved Aventurine. But I remember seeing her and being like, man, I can't wait till she's a playable character. Like, what is her thing gonna be?
Mm-hmm.
And so for these characters, for those that haven't seen the drip marketing, so Robin we know is going to be a physical character who's part of the Harmony
Mm-hmm.
path. Boot Hill is also going to be physical, and he's on the Hunt path. Firefly is going to be a fire character on the Destruction path, and then Jade is going to be a quantum character on the Erudition path.
Mm-hmm.
And so where I am interested in Jade, not only because it's just aesthetically really like the character, and anything that's like a blue or royal blue pearl esque theme tends to get me going in terms of if we
She's
tuned
evil
last week.
Lisa. She looks like evil Lisa.
In terms of character aesthetic,
Yeah.
she fits a profile that if you listen to our episode last week about favorite characters, she falls into that aesthetic with the Yoimikos, the Eula, Yelan type of character. And the fact that she's quantum, we don't know anything about her kit,
Mm-hmm.
but there's a small possibility maybe she fits into a mono quantum team. I don't know, but maybe she doesn't. And if she doesn't, that's fine because erudition typically implies to me, oh, this is maybe going to be a follow up character, which I'm currently working on my follow up team, which currently is going to consist of Dr. Ratio,
Mm-hmm.
Himiko, Topaz, and Nambi, excuse me, or Numbi. And then I'm like, who's that fourth spot going to be? Because ideally that would be where the sustain would go. So you think I would have pulled for Venturine if I was working and prioritizing that team, but I didn't because he ran at the same time as Jing Liu. Sorry,
Uh, so
gotta go with my waifu.
just
And
real
so it just makes
quick,
me wonder what Jade's gonna do. And so I'm very intrigued in her. She will be the one I'm focused on. And luckily, by losing my 50, or I guess luckily or unluckily, the silver lining, I guess, in losing my 50-50 is that I'm now saving up and I will win my Jade pulls once I hit her.
enough. Real quick on her kit. Again, this is all speculation on my part, but I do think that she's going to be a AOE follow up. And the reason why I think that is because so far every IPC character has been follow up based. Dr. Ratio, Topaz, Adventurine have all had follow up as key parts of their kit. I think Jade, the way that she would slot into that team that you mentioned, Dave, is that you'd actually switch between Dr. Ratio or Jade, depending on what you're trying to accomplish, with Dr. Ratio being like your single target guy, and then Jade being potentially, I can't confirm anything because I don't know, but my thought is that Jade will be there to be an AoE follow up attacker that actually does damage, unlike Adventurine, who, let's be blunt, the damage that he does is not amazing. Like, he's not there to damage people with his follow up
His
attacks. He's there
his
to,
shields are ridiculously good though.
yeah.
But and part of me too, because of her, and you mentioned her being part of the IPC and therefore Dr. Ratio, Venturine, Topaz type stuff. She's also part of the 10 Stone Hearts, specifically within the IPC, that is associated with Venturine and Topaz. So it really makes me nervous that to really enable her and the team, you're gonna need a Venturine. So part of me is like gonna and hold my breath and hope I'm not missing out too much
So,
by not going for a Venturine, and that she will still be extremely functional and usable with Topaz, with Dr. Ratio, and Himiko.
so I've got news that you're probably really not going to. I think that she'll be fine without Adventurine. I think what you're going to really be hurting for is either a Robin or a Ruan May. is a support character to slot into a dual follow-up attack team. Because for those of you who are not on the Discord, I did post up on the Discord Braxophone's review of Robin, and Robin is basically built to be a Ruan Mei for follow-up teams. She can work in other teams. She's not handcuffed to follow-up. She's actually very comparable to Ruan Mei in a lot of ways where you could, if it was a team that you would put Ruan Mei in, you could just slot in Robin or vice versa. They are interchangeable. It's just Ruan Mei works better with, I think, dot teams is what I heard. Dot teams and that side of the dual DPS team slot. And Robin leans more to follow up attack because she gives like 20% crit damage to follow up attackers, which is very tiny in comparison to everything else her kit gives. You can 100% put her in with anything. But she is looking like potentially being her best team, basically, for Robin, being Robin, either Dr. Ratio or potentially Jade. Again, we don't know what her kit is. We are just speculating on what her kit might be. But at least from what we know, it would be Robin, Dr. Ratio, Topaz, and then a support. Adventurine being preferred, but any support would technically fill that slot. So yeah, Robin is why I'm going to be honest. I'm in danger because I'm pulling for Robin. I really want Jade and I really want Firefly. And with all three of these back to back, it's looking like if I have to choose one to cut, Firefly is the one I'd have to cut, and I really want her because I want that Henshin. But yeah, sorry, I don't know, Dave. I could be wrong, but just bug in your ear there.
Like you said, I'll be. We don't know because we don't know anything about her or Firefly's kit. Robin's, we know. Yeah, that guide is up there. Brax usually does a pretty good job breaking those down and throwing numbers as well. Does a lot of testing, and then Boot Hill. Again, that's going to be the for you. That's going to be the breather and your chance to recoup some stellar jades. But at 2.3, you're going to be right back at it going for those pulls. So all the best luck to you there. For me, like I said, I'll be sitting back until Jade, we learn more about her. If she is anything remotely follow-up based, I may still just pull for her to fill out that team and then ultimately work on that. Because I think I still have some artifacts even in the follow-up category that would fit nicely because I farmed a lot of that dungeon for a long time because it was also the dot artifact dungeon too. Excited to see what happens and where we go, but yeah, I'll be following your story as well with what's going on with your account and this brutal lineup of want to pull fours.
Yeah, I'm really hoping that after this, we have a long string of just do not pulls for me. Firefly is, I think, the only one that's got me on the hook that doesn't fit into one of my current teams. That would be a complete off the wall. I'm picking you up because I think you're cool. From there on, as long as they pivot away from dot and follow up teams, I'm a little bit safe.
Yeah, I'm a little strapped right now, like I said, because I was trying to pull for E2 Jing Liu. I did get her weapon, or her light cone, excuse me, but yeah, I did not get E2. Unfortunately, lost, and I'm now an owner, not necessarily a proud owner, but an owner of an E3 Welt. Yay.
Hey, you're in good company. E3 Bailu.
But in so I was a little strapped for my pulls in Star Rail. Genshin, man, I'm just waiting for the next character. There hasn't been anything that's really come out as of recent, and nothing that's like on the near horizon that they've marketed out to us that has necessarily caught my attention. So I think my next thing is looking for a rerun maybe of a character I use. So there's a part of me that is a free to play player. E6 or C6 somebody and just go like absolutely all in on that character. But that's where I stand right now, and that's my early impressions. And Steve, any other thoughts for your early impressions on the Star Rail characters?
Nah, we've basically covered everything there. I do feel like we didn't give Firefly enough love in this discussion, in part because I think I'm the only one here who's overly interested in her. I'm super excited for her. Oh, I do also want to drop a called it from when we were talking about part one, the initial release of Piconi,
I
that
did.
Robin did come back. I was not wrong. I called it. She was not dead. Pat myself on the back there. But that's it. I'm good.
Yeah, and that's and I think yeah, it's not like we're glossing over Firefly because I'm not interested in her. It's simply because for me, again, it's because we don't know too much aside
Yeah.
from aesthetically what she looks like and now her path and her element, because we had been introduced to the story a little bit, so we know a little bit about her.
Yeah,
And being destruction, again, that's a path that I've already got filled.
yeah,
Um,
I would say, sorry, just you did spark a memory there for me real quick. I do think that based off of the boss fight against her, she's going to have some sort of health trading mechanic because that's something that as a boss she did, but that could also be like the dominate thing with Kafka, where as a boss, Kafka has the dominate effect, but that didn't transfer over to her kit,
yeah, it didn't transfer
which
to one to one, right?
as a
Yeah.
1-to-1, that there might be that element coming over, but that's also questionable. But that's all I have to say.
Okay. And I'm sure we'll get more once we get into 2.2, because that should be coming up. Because I think the battle pass is expiring probably by the time this goes live. I think it'll be
Yeah,
expiring this coming
basically
weeks.
day after will be when 2.2
Yeah.
drops. So.
And so we'll be on to the next battle pass. We'll be into 2.2, and then as we get deeper into 2.2, maybe be introduced to what Firefly and Jade are going to bring to the table. Shifting away from upcoming characters and updates, I did want to talk very briefly just news in other Gacha games, and then also, since we're talking about these updates, for those of us that play Gacha games and play them on our phone, something I came across, I've been having some storage space, and I wanted to bring up this tip for those of you guys that do have similar storage space concerns and like, oh man, I gotta delete this whole game, and which one am I gonna quit? If you go in and you check the storage space, you are able to sometimes offload apps, or which basically keeps them on your phone but dumps a lot of the main data, but it keeps your game account and stuff like that. So if you ever reinstall it, and others, sometimes you recommend just completely uninstalling the game and reinstalling it. As an example, Eversoul had a pretty big update, and it didn't fully update for me because I hit my storage space. So I went in, was looking, and I saw that Eversoul, it said, was like something 50 gigabytes. And I was like, this can't be right. That's way too big. Like where this isn't like Genshin. Like that's a lot. And so I went in, offloaded the app, and then reinstalled it, and now it's only 10 or 12 gigabytes. So something about the way they optimized, or I guess didn't optimize, whenever new patches came out. So just a friendly reminder to those that have storage space issues, periodically offloading an app and then reinstalling it can help reduce that storage size, and then you can ultimately save more things on your phone, because that's obviously 52 down to 12 is a huge difference. And then I did similar thing with Nikkei, similar with Epic 7, just offloading them and then reinstalling them to help reduce that file size. Little thing there. As far as other news in Gacha games going on, we've got a couple games that we play that are doing a couple different collaborations. So Girls Frontline, it's an older Gacha. They are doing a Ghost in Shell collaboration that's starting soon for them. I know for me with that game, Girls Frontline is on my radar because of Girls Frontline 2, and we're gonna see that in the global release later this year, because that's going to be a game similar to the old XCOM strategy RPGs, if you guys are familiar with that. It's out in China, I think, right now, but you have to have the Bilibili account and go through all the things there, which VPNs and such. But anyway, if you're playing Girls Frontline, starting to Ghost in Shell collab soon. Steve, are you still dabbling in Girls Frontline, or is that on hiatus?
It's on hiatus. I think I might repick it up for this collab. For all of you who listened to me complain about collabs at the beginning of this season, yeah, it was enough to maybe get me back into this. I'm definitely keeping an eye on it.
So that would be Ghost Shell as a collab that you identify with the source material, and yeah, it's gonna at least give you a re-download to see what the event's providing, everything like
Yeah,
that.
yeah,
So
a chance at maybe the major or somebody like that.
yeah. So on the flip side, to one that gets you to move back to the game, Blue Archive is also doing a collaboration that just came out this past week, involving a collaboration with a certain scientific railgun, which I'll be honest, not familiar with that source material at all. Believe it's an anime, or maybe it's just like a manga or a short story. I don't actually know, but I'm playing Blue Archive passively, so this one didn't move the needle for me in terms of wanting to pull for these characters, since again I have no attachment to the source material. But maybe it's a hit with other folks that are familiar with the source material.
Yeah,
Though I was gonna say,
it's
to Blue Archive's credit, it would appear the source material does at least fit the universe that Blue Archive is set in, which is you're the main character who's the teacher at a school with a bunch of girls. Yeah, and that's a whole nother discussion about that.
Yeah.
But at least the source material fits that teacher student dynamic in like high school setting as opposed to collabs. Yeah, during the collab episode we talked about fit or lack thereof, looking at you, Nikkei, with your ReZero collab. But that's kind of all the news as far as some collaborations we have going on. I believe Epic 7 still has their Overlord collaboration still going on, where they gave the main protagonist, the Overlord, away for free for doing the event if you beat the very easy story quests. And then the two pullable characters were his two, I forget their names. I think Albedo is one of them. She's the demon girl in the bride's dress, and then the other demon girl who's more of the stereotypical lolly. Both of those were, yeah,
no problem.
both of those were pullable characters, so I pulled for both of them, got them. But that collab going on currently. Other Gacha news: Brown Dust 2 just introduced a new character and with two costumes, essentially because each costume is a different skill in that particular game, how they do it. She's a support character, but if you're familiar with the lore in Brown Dust or Brave 9, she's one of the stronger characters in the original game and in the lore for lore purposes, and she's shaping up to be a pretty decent support to do it all in terms of shielding, attack, or crit damage boosting, stuff like that. So I'll be interested to see what the sales numbers on her banners are. Steve, any from you? Any last little bits or news that you saw? Funny stories, maybe?
No, I think I'm good for us to roll out.
All right. Then I would do want to then go ahead and just say, hey, thank you everybody for joining us this week. Let us know down below what your thoughts are on Power Creep and your other gachas that you're playing, or maybe what you think the state of the Genshin and Star Rail Power Creep currently is. Maybe you disagree with something we've said tonight, or maybe you agree completely with us, but let us know down below. If you enjoyed the episode, of course, leave us a comment. Be sure to like, follow, and subscribe to the channel. You can email us at brohoyopod@gmail.com with questions or suggestions for the show. Again, we'll also have a link down below for our Discord, so you can join us over there for other gacha news, putting together some game nights. We've been playing a lot of Helldivers 2 recently, and then also, of course, content notifications, things like that. Join us next week. We're going to be discussing account building and the approaches to collecting every character versus investing and only pulling for a few. But until next time, keep gaming.
We made a choice, go fight against your fate. Pain will come with the blade. Pain will wake up the despondent, crowding, storming world somehow. Unsheath the sword not to kill. Unsheath the sword to handle. Clouds above the ground. Wake up, it's time to gather now. We have no